what is lost on the producers of this documentary is that that won't work. What this proves is that we don't need an SEC at all, because the SEC did harm, not good. Had we had no SEC, like we didn't have an SEC when the original Charles Ponzi pulled off a Ponzi scheme, the market sniffs out these Ponzi schemes a lot quicker and brings them to an end before you have the type of losses like those experienced under Madoff. And that is exactly what I've been saying on this podcast. But the reason I'm bringing this up now is I'm talking about Ponzi schemes. And in fact, when Bernie Madoff was interviewed by the New York Times, he actually pointed out that the United States government was running a much bigger Ponzi scheme than the one he was. And I remember, and I used to joke about this, but the New York Times said that, well, we shouldn't pay any attention to Bernie Madoff because he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't have any credibility. And I would say, well, wait a minute. He's got credibility about one thing: Ponzi schemes. He knows them when he sees them. And so if Bernie Madoff accuses the U.S. government of running a Ponzi scheme, that's a credible accusation because he ought to know. And in fact, that's what I used to joke, that instead of putting Bernie Madoff in jail, we should have made him Secretary of the Treasury. Because one of the things that Bernie Madoff knows that apparently Janet Yellen and other secretaries of the Treasury don't know is that when you're running a Ponzi scheme, you don't tell anybody. You keep it quiet. You see, that's the key. That's Ponzi 101. But no, the Treasury Secretary actually tells people it's a Ponzi scheme, and they don't care. And probably the reason they don't care is because they know that the U.S. government is never going to default, because it doesn't have to worry about getting new investors. It could just print money. In fact, there was somebody at Davos, I don't remember who it was, and he was being interviewed by Steve Leisman of CNBC, and Leisman asked him if he was worried about the size of the debt. And he said, no, I'm not worried because we have something called a printing press. Yes, that's even more worrisome. The fact that they have a printing press, that's what we need to worry about. And the more debt you have, the more you have to worry that the government is going to use that printing press because they can't possibly repay the debt. Now, the reason Madoff's Ponzi scheme fell apart was not because the regulators put him out of business. The 2008 financial crisis put him out of business. Now, ironically, that was also caused by government. So the only way the government put an end to the Madoff Ponzi scheme was by creating the 2008 financial crisis. Now, what happened was the financial crisis was so bad and the stock market dropped so much that a lot of Bernie Madoff's customers needed their money back. Now, of course, Madoff didn't report any losses because he didn't have any real trades. He was actually reporting profits while everybody else was reporting huge losses. And so a lot of Madoff's clients needed money. And so the only account they had that went up was Bernie's. And so they tried to withdraw some money. Of course, they got all these people wanting to withdraw money, but nobody wanted to put any money in because everybody was losing so much money. And so that's when the Ponzi scheme fell apart, because they couldn't get any new investors to pay off the old investors. Well, that is exactly where we are with the national debt. And that's what Janet Yellen admitted. Janet Yellen said, if we do not raise the debt ceiling, meaning if we can't borrow new money, then we can't pay back any of the investors who already loaned us money. In other words, the only way America can repay its bills is by borrowing more money from new investors so we can pay off the old investors. That is the exact definition of a Ponzi scheme. The only difference is this Ponzi scheme is being run out in the open by the U.S. government, and Bernie Madoff's was a privately run scheme that was being run in secret. But just like Madoff's scheme collapsed, this scheme will eventually collapse. And the way it will collapse is the lenders won't want to lend anymore. When they recognize that it's a Ponzi and they realize the only way they're going to get repaid is with inflated money, because the federal government is going to have to print money because there's no way to actually repay through legitimate taxation, then nobody is going to want to buy U.S. Treasuries. And so the only buyer left will be the lender of last resort, and that's the Federal Reserve. But when 100% of the debts are being monetized by the Fed, in fact, not just the new debt, but all of the maturing debt needs to be monetized by the Federal Reserve because everybody else wants to take their money and run. Nobody who owns treasuries wants to roll them over. They just want to get their cash while they can and get out of Dodge. Then you don't just have an inflation problem, you have a hyperinflation problem. Now, the other statements that are being made that always bother me every time we're talking about raising the debt ceiling is you'll hear members of the Biden administration saying that we have to raise the debt ceiling because America always pays its bills. And if we don't raise the debt ceiling, then for the first time, we won't be able to pay our bills. That is complete nonsense. The reason we have to raise the debt ceiling is precisely because we don't pay our bills. If we paid our bills, we wouldn't have debt. The reason we have $31.5 trillion of debt is because those are $31.5 trillion worth of bills that we did not pay. Instead of paying our bills, we borrowed all that money. And so the reason we want to raise the debt ceiling is not so we can pay our bills, but so we can continue not paying our bills and instead running up a bigger debt. Because if America wanted to pay its bills, it could pay the bills. We don't have to raise the debt ceiling to pay the bills. We just have to raise taxes, or we just have to cut other spending so we have enough money to pay for the spending that we want to prioritize. But we don't want to do any of that. We don't want to be fiscally responsible. We want to continue being fiscally irresponsible, and we want to raise the debt ceiling. That's what's so frustrating about all the people who are saying we need to act responsibly and increase the debt ceiling. The responsible thing to do is not to raise the debt ceiling and for the first time actually pay our bills. The other thing that bothers me is when members of the administration say how America has never defaulted on its obligations, and so we need to raise the debt ceiling because it would be a huge disaster if for the first time America had to default. And that's not a true statement. America has a history of default. That's what we did in 1971, because prior to 1971, all Federal Reserve notes, and that's what they were, notes, were obligations to pay a fixed weight in gold. That's what we owed. So if you owed a Federal Reserve note, the Federal Reserve owed you gold. That's what the note promised to pay. Well, what happened in 1971 was that we defaulted. We told all of our creditors who were owed gold that you were going to get none of the gold that the Federal Reserve was obligated to pay you. In other words, it was a complete default. It wasn't just a partial default. We didn't tell our creditors that they were going to get less gold than what they were owed. We told them they weren't getting any gold at all. It was a complete default. So if America was willing to default on that obligation, why wouldn't it be willing to default on the current obligations, which aren't even as great as having to pay gold, because all we're paying is dollars, and we could print those at will. You see, we can't print gold. That has to be mined. It's easy to print dollars, but again, that's why we may not default on this promise, because we can print all the dollars we want. The problem is we can't print any purchasing power, and it's not much of a consolation to our creditors if we don't default, but instead we repay our debts